Hello everyone and welcome. I am the Congressman and today we're going to be talking about names, specifically congressional names, but even more specifically, the name George Washington. Now to be clear, I'm not talking about this guy, I'm talking about these guys. They were all born in different times, in different places, and they all have very different life stories, but they all have two things in common. They were all named George Washington, and they all became congressmen. This is a brief history of the many congressional George Washingtons. Over the past 200 plus years, many things about America and American culture... Wait, hold on. Over the last 200 plus years, many things about America and American culture have changed, some of them drastically. But one thing that has always been true and always will be true is that men and women make babies. And when those babies are born, the new parents have to give them a name. Now today, that name could be anything. There are no rules. It's like the Wild West out here. Some new parents give their kids a name that's just a random noun, and still others give their little human shields a name that isn't even a real word. I kid. I kid because I hate. But anyway, 200 years ago, new parents basically just had three naming conventions to choose from. They could name their kids from the Bible, they could name them after friends and family, and the old standby, name them after famous people. And in an age before celebrity culture, there was no American more famous than George Washington. So naturally, there were a ton of children named after him. That's not really surprising. What is surprising is how many of them weren't simply named George, but were fully named George Washington as their first and middle names. And growing up with a name like that, it's only natural that many of them entered politics. And over the course of 155 years, 54 of them made it all the way to the United States Congress, specifically the House of Representatives. That weird little bit might be the biggest surprise of all. 54 congressional George Washingtons, and none of them became senators, just representatives. Let's dive in. It all started with the 15th Congress in 1817, and a man named George Washington Lent Marr of Tennessee. He served his 2-year term, did not run for re-election, and went home in 1819. Fun fact, that home that he returned to was a place called Island No. 10, which was located in the Mississippi River, between New Madrid, Missouri, and Tiptonville, Tennessee. And I say was located because it doesn't really exist anymore. Over the course of the last 100 years or so, it's mostly been eroded away. 4 years later, in 1823, George Washington Owen of Alabama joined the 18th Congress. At just 26 years old, Owen was the youngest of all 54 congressional George Washingtons. He served 3 terms before going home at the end of the 20th Congress in 1829, and for another 4 years, Congress was without a George Washington. But things started to pick up in 1833. George Washington Lay of New York joined the 23rd Congress. And in 1835, Lay was joined by not one, but 2 others, George Washington Hopkins of Virginia and George Washington Bonaparte Towns of Georgia. So the 24th Congress started with 3 George Washingtons, but it didn't last long. Bonaparte Towns resigned in 1836 for unknown reasons, and Lay did not run for re-election, so his term ended in 1837. But Hopkins wasn't going to be left alone. For the 25th Congress, he was joined by 2 others. One was George Washington Toland of Pennsylvania, and the other was a returning George Washington Bonaparte Towns of Georgia. I don't know why he originally resigned, but he must have changed his mind, because just a month after he left, he was elected right back to Congress. This time he served a full term, but did not run for re-election, so he left in 1839. And so, for the 26th and 27th Congresses, it was Hopkins and Toland. Heading into 1843, Toland was not re-elected, but as soon as his term ended, another one began. This was George Washington Jones of Tennessee. When Jones took his seat in the 28th Congress, he became the second George Washington to represent Tennessee in the House and the 4th one who had been born in Virginia. In 1845, Georgia's representative-elect declined his seat, so they specially elected a replacement. And on January 27, 1846, that man finally arrived. It was a returning George Washington Bonaparte Towns, back for a 3rd non-consecutive term in the House. And in a wonderful coincidence, the guy who had originally been elected but declined his seat was named Washington Poe. Bonaparte Towns finished the remainder of the 29th Congress but did not run for re-election because he became governor of Georgia instead. Meanwhile, Hopkins also did not run for re-election because he was appointed ambassador to Portugal by President Polk. But Jones wasn't going to be left alone. In fact, when the 30th Congress started in 1847, he wasn't even alone in his own delegation. He was joined by fellow Tennessean George Washington Barrow. So, Tennessee became the first state to have two George Washingtons at the same time. But that only lasted for one term. Barrow served his 2 years and did not run for re-election. In 1849, his term ended, but a new one began. This one was George Washington Julian of Indiana. During the 31st Congress, two things happened, and each resulted in a new Congressional George Washington. And, coincidentally, those two things happened on the same day, September 9th, 1850. On that day, New Hampshire Representative James Wilson resigned, and California officially became a state. To replace Wilson, New Hampshire had to hold a special election, but in California they had already elected their first representatives, and both guys were already in Washington just waiting patiently for statehood so they could be allowed to take their seats. So, on September 11th, 1850, George Washington Wright joined the 31st Congress. Meanwhile, New Hampshire held their special election during the recess of 1850, and on December 2nd, George Washington Morrison joined. So, for the final few months of the 31st Congress, there were 4 George Washingtons. But only Jones was re-elected, so for the 32nd Congress, he was all alone. But for the 33rd Congress in 1853, he was joined by not 1, not 2, but 3 more George Washingtons. One of them was a returning George Washington Morrison of New Hampshire, and this time he brought a buddy with him, George Washington Kittredge. So New Hampshire became the second state to have 2 George Washingtons at the same time. The other new one was George Washington Smith of Texas. All 3 of them served 1 term and were not re-elected. But Jones wasn't going to be left alone. For the 34th Congress in 1855, he was joined by George Washington Peck of Michigan. Peck served 1 term and lost his bid for re-election, so his term ended in 1857. But once again, Jones wasn't going to be left alone. While Peck was losing his election in Michigan, Virginia elected George Washington Hopkins, the former representative from 10 years earlier. Heading into 1859, neither Hopkins nor Jones ran for re-election, so the 36th Congress from 1859 to 1861 had 0 George Washingtons for the first time in 26 years. But it was a close call. Although the 2 incumbents didn't run, there was an election in Ohio where the whimsically named George Washington Manypenny challenged the incumbent Sydnor B. Tompkins, but lost in a close election. More about him and the other George Washingtons who tried and failed in their congressional bids later. For now, though, let's get comfortable, because the George Washington mania is about to get a little crazy. Over the course of 42 years, from 1817 to 1859, there had been 14 Congressional George Washingtons. And this would be a good time to pause and take a breath and start tracking some data, because we're about to be inundated with George Washingtons, and if we don't try to maintain some sort of order, it'll just turn into a big George Washington pileup, and it'll be a total mess. The 14 George Washingtons represented 11 states. 2 of those states, Tennessee and New Hampshire, had 2 Congressional George Washingtons at the same time. As for individuals, 3 of them, Bonaparte Towns of Georgia, Hopkins of Virginia, and Morrison of New Hampshire, served non-consecutive terms, but the longest total time in office actually goes to George Washington Jones of Tennessee, who served 8 straight terms for a total of 16 years in the House. The shortest time in office was George Washington Wright of California, who only served 6 months. So we left off with the 36th Congress from 1859 to 1861, where there were 0 George Washingtons. That would be the last time Congress was completely devoid of George Washingtons until 1935. For the next 74 years, there would always be at least 1 George Washington in the House. So here we go. In 1861, the 37th Congress started with 3. The first was George Washington Dunlap of Kentucky, who was the second Congressional George Washington to have been born on the real Washington's birthday, February 22nd. Next, we had George Washington Julian of Indiana, a former representative from 10 years earlier. And the third new one was George Washington Bridges of Tennessee. Fun fact, the George Washington Bridges story is insane. Here's the short version. Tennessee had 10 districts, and in the third, Bridges was running against Albert Welker. That part's normal, just another congressional election like any other. However, Tennessee seceded from the Union and officially joined the Confederacy on July 2, 1861, 1 month before its congressional elections. As a result, most of the state's elections were for the Confederate Congress instead, but not in the first 3 districts where pro-union sentiment was still very strong. In those elections, which included Bridges versus Welker, one guy was elected to the United States Congress and the other was elected to the Confederate Congress. Messy, but it doesn't end there. Bridges was elected to the U.S. Congress in August of 1861. But as a pro-union official in the now Confederate state of Tennessee, he was a target, and he was soon arrested. He remained in jail for over a year before he managed to escape on February 5, 1863. Naturally, the very first thing he did was go straight to Washington so he could take his seat in Congress. Which he did on February 25, 1863, just in time to serve for 6 days before his term ended. And since Tennessee was by now a fully Confederate state, there were no elections for the United States Congress in 1863, so Bridges couldn't be re-elected. This man spent over a year in a Confederate prison, managed to escape from that prison, then went all the way to Washington, D.C. just to serve in Congress for 6 days. That's the sort of dedication that's missing from today's Congress. That and spines. Anyway, here's the best part. Because George Washington Bridges had been regularly elected, then his term officially starts March 4, 1861, regardless of when the election had actually been held or how late he arrived and took his seat. So even though he only spent 6 days in Congress, he still gets credit for a full 2-year term. Okay, so where were we? In 1863, Dunlap and Bridges each left after 1 term, and so Julian was alone in the 38th Congress. But in 1865, he was joined by George Washington Anderson of Missouri. In 1867, Julian and Anderson were joined by George Washington Morgan of Ohio and George Washington Woodward of Pennsylvania. But even though both guys were there on the first day of the first session of the 40th Congress on December 2, 1867, their terms have different official starting dates because of the nature of their elections. Morgan's term started at the beginning of the congressional term, March 4, 1867, because he defeated the incumbent in the regular election. Woodward was specially elected in November to replace the deceased Charles Dennison, so his term started when he first arrived to take his seat on December 2, 1867. So Congress was back up to 4 George Washingtons again, but that only lasted about 6 months before Morgan was replaced. The incumbent that he had defeated contested the election, won his challenge, and replaced Morgan on June 3, 1868. Fun fact, that guy was named Columbus Delano, and as you may guess from the name, he was in fact distantly related to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and by extension Theodore Roosevelt, and also Ulysses S. Grant and Calvin Coolidge. In fact, almost all US presidents are distantly related. I highly recommend this video from Useful Charts to learn more about it. After you finish this video, of course. Anyway, heading into the 41st Congress in 1869, Woodward and Julian were re-elected, but Anderson was not. But you know who was elected? George Washington Morgan. After getting replaced, he went back home to Ohio and immediately ran again, this time defeating Columbus Delano by a slightly better margin. So Woodward, Julian, and Morgan were back, and they were joined by 2 more, George Washington McCrary of Iowa and George Washington Cowles of New York. So now Congress was up to 5 George Washingtons, a new record. But why settle for 5 when you could have 6? In 1870, during the 41st Congress, Texas was readmitted to the Union after a 10-year, let's say, vacation. And in the 1st District, the voters demonstrated their patriotic recommitment to America by electing George Washington Whitmore, who gets bonus points for sharing a name with the president from Independence Day. The 41st Congress ended in 1871, and so did the terms of Julian, Woodward, Cowles, and Whitmore. So for the 42nd Congress, it was just Morgan and McCrary. In 1873, Morgan's term ended after just barely losing his bid for re-election, and so for the 43rd Congress, McCrary was all alone. But when the 44th Congress started in 1875, he was joined by George Washington Cate of Wisconsin. Heading into 1877, neither McCrary nor Cate were re-elected. But in New York's 33rd District, they elected George Washington Patterson. Fun fact, remember at the beginning when I said none of the Congressional George Washingtons were senators? Well, it wasn't for lack of trying. Patterson had been an unsuccessful candidate for the Senate back in 1843, a full 34 years earlier. Also, on a related note, Patterson was by far the oldest Congressional George Washington. He was 77, so old that he had actually been born 1 month before the real George Washington died in December of 1799. Anyway, Patterson served his one term, did not run for re-election, and promptly died 7 months after leaving office in 1879. But while George Washington Patterson was on his way out, 3 others were on their way in. For the 46th Congress in 1879, there was George Washington Geddes of Ohio, who had been born in a place called Mount Vernon, George Washington Jones of Texas, which is the only duplicate name on this entire list, and George Washington Ladd of Maine. Heading into 1881, all 3 of those guys were re-elected, and they were joined by 3 more. George Washington Steele of Indiana, George Washington Covington of Maryland, and George Washington Weber of Michigan. Heading into 1883, Weber, Ladd, and Jones were not re-elected. But in New York's 21st District, they elected George Washington Ray, not to be confused with earlier New York Representative George Washington Lay. Ray was New York's 4th George Washington, tying them with Tennessee for most congressional George Washingtons. In 1885, Ray and Covington were not re-elected, but as soon as their terms ended, 2 new ones started. One was George Washington Emory Dorsey of Nebraska, and the other was George Washington Flieger of Pennsylvania. In 1887, Flieger and Geddes were not re-elected, but in Ohio's 20th District, they elected George Washington Krause. In 1889, Krause and Steele were not re-elected, but as soon as their terms ended, 2 new ones started. And in fact, both new ones were from the same state. Illinois elected George Washington Fithian from the 16th District and George Washington Smith from the 20th District. Now earlier, I said George Washington Jones was the only duplicate name on this list, and I stand by that. Smith is pretty close to being a duplicate surname, but the other one, George Washington Smith of Texas, was spelled with a Y. Now, maybe that's supposed to be pronounced Smythe, but I don't like that, and I'm not going to do it. My apologies to any such Smiths out there. Feel free to yell at me in the comments. Anyway, as for Fithian, he was the first congressional George Washington who had been born on the 4th of July. Heading into the 52nd Congress in 1891, Emory Dorsey was not re-elected, but Fithian and Smith were. In fact, Illinois tried to set a new record by sending a 3rd George Washington to Congress, but George Washington Pillow lost his election in the 19th District. But that's okay, because 4 other states stepped up. We got George Washington Schenck from Pennsylvania, George Washington Schell from South Carolina, George Washington Hoke from Ohio, and George Washington Ray from New York, the former representative from 8 years earlier. Also, Schenck and Hoke were the 4th George Washingtons from Pennsylvania and Ohio, respectively, tying those 2 states with Tennessee and New York for most congressional George Washingtons. In 1893, Schenck was not re-elected, but nonetheless, the 53rd Congress is where we reached peak George Washington. Schell, Smith, Ray, Hoke, and Fithian were all re-elected, and they were joined by 3 more. First, there was George Washington Murray of South Carolina, who joined with Schell to give their delegation 2 simultaneous George Washingtons. But Ohio said hold my beer and copied Illinois from a few years earlier by sending 2 new ones at the same time. George Washington Hewlett came from the 6th District and George Washington Wilson from the 7th District. They joined with Hoke from the 3rd District to give their delegation 3 at the same time. Another new record. Speaking of records, those 2 new George Washingtons put Ohio up to 6 overall, breaking that 4-way tie. But peak George Washington only lasted 11 months before George Washington Hoke died on February 9, 1894. So for the final year of the 53rd Congress, there were only 7. In 1895, Murray, Schell, and Fithian were not re-elected. But on the plus side, Indiana sent back George Washington Steele, the former congressman from 6 years earlier. But wait! Back in January, a couple months before the 53rd Congress ended and the 54th Congress started, Illinois Representative Philip Post had died. They finally held the special election to replace him in the summer of 1895, and the winner was George Washington Prince, who joined the 54th Congress on December 2nd. Meanwhile, over in South Carolina, former Representative George Washington Murray contested his loss and eventually won the challenge, so he rejoined the House on June 4, 1896. And so, for the last 9 months of the 54th Congress, they were back up to 7 George Washingtons. In 1897, Murray, Wilson, and Hewlett were not re-elected. But as soon as their terms ended, 2 new ones started, George Washington Taylor of Alabama and George Washington Ferris of Indiana. In 1899, all 6 guys were re-elected, plus another new one, George Washington Cromer of Indiana. So Indiana gets to join the 2 George Washingtons at the same time club. In 1901, Ferris was not re-elected, and later in the 57th Congress on September 11, 1902, Ray of New York resigned to accept a federal judicial post. By far the worst thing to happen to New York on that day. So for the last 6 months of the 57th Congress, there were 5. That Congress ended in 1903, and so did the term of George Washington's Steel. For the next 4 years, there were no new George Washingtons, but on the plus side, Taylor, Cromer, Smith, and Prince kept getting re-elected. Heading into the 60th Congress in 1907, Cromer was not re-elected. But we did get one final burst of new George Washingtons. 4 of them, to be exact. In Indiana, they balanced out the loss of Cromer by electing George Washington Rock, who was not only born on February 22nd, but it was in 1876, America's centennial. There was zero chance that he was not going to be named George Washington. Over in Tennessee, they elected George Washington Gordon. Colorado got in on the action by electing George Washington Cook, and finally there was George Washington Kipp of Pennsylvania. In 1909, Kipp and Cook were not re-elected. In 1911, Gordon was not re-elected. But you know who was? Kipp! He started his new term in 1911 and promptly died 4 months later. Heading into the 63rd Congress in 1913, it was Prince's turn to not be re-elected. But as soon as his term ended, a new one started, George Washington Edmunds of Pennsylvania. Edmunds was the 5th and final Congressional George Washington to have been born on February 22nd, and he was Pennsylvania's 6th, tying them with Ohio on the overall list. Heading into 1915, Taylor was not re-elected. Heading into 1917, Rock was not re-elected. So for the next 6 years, Edmunds was all alone. It was the first time that the House only had one George Washington since New York's George Washington Patterson was there all by himself 40 years earlier. For the 68th Congress in 1923, Edmunds was joined by George Washington Lindsay of New York. In 1925, Edmunds was not re-elected, but Lindsay was, and Lindsay continued to be re-elected all the way to 1933 when he finally got some company. One was George Washington Blanchard of Wisconsin, and the other was a returning George Washington Edmunds of Pennsylvania, who became the 10th and final Congressional George Washington to serve non-consecutive terms. In 1935, all 3 guys were not re-elected, although Edmunds came damn close, and so, for the first time in 74 years, there were no George Washingtons in Congress. And it seems that the George Washington mania had finally passed, because this time the drought lasted for 35 years. George Washington Collins of Illinois became the final Congressional George Washington when he was specially elected to replace the deceased Daniel J. Ronan in 1970. Collins served the rest of that term and was re-elected to the next one, but just a month after the election, he died in a plane crash on December 8, 1972. He was, at least as of 2025, not only the last George Washington to serve in Congress, but the last one to even try. Speaking of which... From 1817 to 1972, there were 54 Congressional George Washingtons, but during that time there were also plenty of others who tried and failed. Plenty of others that we know about, that is. You see, quick note here. Reading through 200 years worth of election results, I came across an absolute shit ton of George W's that didn't have Wikipedia pages. I did give each one of them a quick online search to see if I could find out what the W stood for, but I wasn't about to spend 1,000 hours digging a whole lot deeper than that. Especially since most of them are named George William, and statistically speaking, nobody's watching this video this far into it anyway. So, all that is to say, the guys that I'm going to tell you about are actual for sure George Washingtons, but there may be, and probably are, dozens more that I didn't discover, especially considering just how many 19th century election records are lost. So anyway, here are the George Washingtons who tried and failed. In 1844, the election in which Jones and Hopkins were re-elected, there were 4 others who lost. George Washington Wisner of Michigan, George Washington Nesmith of New Hampshire, George Washington Bowling of Virginia, and George Washington Southall, also of Virginia. Together with the successful George Washington Hopkins, that meant 1844 saw 3 different George Washingtons running for Congress from Virginia, a feat that Ohio would accomplish successfully several decades later. In 1854, there was George Washington Bowie of California, and in 1858, there was George Washington Moneypenny of Ohio. In 1874, there was George Washington Henderlight of Virginia. Fun fact, a few years later, in 1880, he traveled to Washington, D.C., where he died by suicide by jumping out of a hotel window. I guess that wasn't really a fun fact. Let's just keep moving. In 1880, there was George Washington Witherspoon of Florida, and in 1890, there was George Washington Pillow of Illinois. In that election, like Virginia 46 years earlier and Ohio a few years later, Illinois had 3 George Washingtons running at the same time. Pillow lost while Fithian and Smith won. In 1892, the peak George Washington cycle, where 8 of them were elected, there was also a George Washington Gales in Mississippi who was not. Also in 1892, in Indiana's 9th district, both of the losing fringe candidates were George W's. I couldn't find any info on either one of them, so I don't know if they were George Washingtons. But if they were, then that would be, so far as I can tell, the only time in American history where 2 George Washingtons ran in the same election. Peak George Washington indeed. 1894 saw failed congressional bids from George Washington Levis of Wisconsin and George Washington Woodby of Nebraska. Would be a congressman, am I right? In 1906, there was George Washington Hardman of West Virginia. 6 years later, in 1912, there was George Washington Dornbach of Pennsylvania, a rare socialist George Washington. Although, in 2 other Pennsylvania districts that year, there were George W's Bacon and Fox, who were also socialist candidates, but I couldn't find any information on their middle names. In 1918, there was George Washington Martin of New York. In 1932, there was George Washington Henley of Indiana, and in 1934, there was George Washington Hartman of Pennsylvania. Another Pennsylvania socialist George Washington. Maybe those aren't as rare as I thought. In fact, in 1936, 3 different Pennsylvania districts had socialists named George W. I couldn't find any info on their middle names either, but surely one of them was a George Washington, right? I hope it was Murgatroyd. That is a wild last name. Anyway, for the next ones, we have to jump all the way to 1968. In New Jersey, George Washington Luke ran for the House and lost, and in Oklahoma, a man actually named George Washington ran for Senate and lost. And that was it. In 1972, when George Washington Collins of Illinois died in that plane crash, it seems that the name George Washington died too. There hasn't been a single one since then. In fact, not only have there been no George Washingtons in any congressional election since then, but there haven't even been any George W's since Ames and Bush, yes, that one, in 1978. There are plenty of reasons why this might be, but I think the biggest is that over the course of the 20th century, with the rise of an entire entertainment industry and the birth of celebrity culture, new parents just had a whole new world of famous people to name their children after. And the idea of naming your kid after George Washington just fell out of style. That said, though, I know there are still people named George. I've met several of them. And surely, somebody, somewhere, has to be named George Washington, right? If you know that person, or if you are that person, I am begging you to run for Congress. You'll be the first one to do so in over 50 years. And you should especially do it if you live in Ohio or Pennsylvania. That tie at the top of the list is really bothering me. So we looked at the overview, we talked about the ones who tried and failed, and now it's time to ask ourselves, which congressional George Washingtons, if any, are comparable to the George Washington? Well, to answer that, let's start with what we know about the OG. Original George, obviously. The George Washington was born on February 22nd, as were 5 of our congressmen. The George Washington was born in Virginia. Again, 5 of our congressmen fit that description. It's interesting that 5 of them were born in Virginia, but only 1 stayed there. And that one, George Washington Hopkins, seems to be the clear winner so far. But beyond his date and place of birth, he doesn't share much in common with the original George. Hopkins was a school teacher and a lawyer. He entered politics early, serving as a state representative, ambassador to Portugal, and Washington, D.C. Circuit Court judge. So let's keep digging. The George Washington was a lifelong military guy who fought in multiple wars. For this one, 18 of them fit the description in the sense that they were in the military and fought in war, but not all of them fit in the same spirit. I'll explain. So George Washington Lent Marr of Tennessee fought in the War of 1812, and George Washington Collins of Illinois fought in World War II. The other 16 all fought in the Civil War, but 6 of them fought for the Confederate Army, which I feel disqualifies them from consideration. The remaining 10 fought for the Union Army. Of those, George Washington Morgan of Ohio had also previously fought in the Texas War of Independence in the 1830s and in the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, in which he was wounded in 1847. Between fighting for a nation's independence and being a career military guy who fought in multiple wars over the course of multiple decades, I think Morgan is the clear winner in this category. What about their political careers? Well, the George Washington entered at the highest level, President of the United States. Obviously, none of our congressmen became president. They didn't even become senators, but several of them did hold executive positions in their local governments. George Washington Bonaparte Towns of Georgia became governor of Georgia, and George Washington Steele of Indiana became governor of the Oklahoma Territory. In addition to those two, 6 of them served as mayors. In addition, George Washington Morgan of Ohio and George Washington Woodward of Pennsylvania did run for governor of their respective states, but were unsuccessful. Eagle-eyed viewers will have noticed that George Washington Wilson of Ohio has matched the original George several times. He was on the mayor list, he fought for the Union in the Civil War, and he was born on February 22nd. But I'm actually going to go with George Washington Steele of Indiana for this category. After his time in Congress, Steele was appointed governor of the new Oklahoma Territory. Right off the bat, being appointed governor is similar to the original George in the sense that, sure, President Washington was technically elected, but for all intents and purposes, he had actually been appointed by the framers of the Constitution in 1787. Also, Steele was the very first governor of the Oklahoma Territory, and during his term, he dealt with a fractious and combative legislature that wanted to relocate the capital. That sure sounds familiar. Steele was also a big proponent of public education. He pushed for the establishment of not 1, but 2 colleges in the territory, and just 6 months into his term, he got his way. Norman Territorial University and Stillwater A&M College were established in December of 1890, and both are still going today, better known respectively as the University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University. So we do have a few standouts: George Washington's Morgan, Hopkins, Wilson, and Steele. But there are a few others with similarities that are worth pointing out. The George Washington had an older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who he looked up to and tried to emulate in his professional life. In that same vein, George Washington Barrow of Tennessee got into politics following his own older half-brother, Alexander Barrow, who was a senator from Louisiana. George Washington Julian of Indiana was the only one of the 54 congressional George Washingtons to flirt with presidential politics. He was the vice presidential candidate for the Free Soil Party in 1852. He was also similar to the George Washington in the sense that both lost their fathers at a young age. Also, not for nothing, both men were considered significantly taller than average. George Washington Smith of Texas had been a surveyor in his early days. George Washington Geddes of Ohio was born in a place called Mount Vernon. And George Washington Shell of South Carolina died on December 15, 1899, just one day after the 100th anniversary of the death of the original George. Almost a fantastic coincidence. In the end, though, none of the congressional George Washingtons are truly comparable to the George Washington. I know that's kind of a cop-out answer, but, I mean, come on. That said, I think George Washington Morgan of Ohio is the closest we've got. He was born in Washington County, Pennsylvania. He attended Washington and Jefferson College. He joined the military at an early age, and he did so because he looked up to his older brother, who was, coincidentally, named Thomas Jefferson Morgan. Their parents really had a thing for the early presidents. He moved to Texas and fought in its war for independence. After that succeeded, he joined the regular Texas Army, serving under Sam Houston before moving back to Pennsylvania. He entered West Point in 1841, but had to withdraw in 1843 due to bad grades. He immediately moved to Ohio, specifically to Mount Vernon, and decided to become a lawyer, and even served as Knox County prosecutor in 1845, but then the Mexican War started and Morgan immediately signed up. He served under General Winfield Scott and was wounded at the Battle of Churubusco in 1847. After that war, he returned to the law and became a prominent citizen. In the 1850s, he even became a diplomat, serving as U.S. Consul to France at Marseille and as ambassador to Portugal. But then the Civil War started, and again, Morgan immediately signed up. He served in the Union Army as a brigadier general. After the war, he ran unsuccessfully for governor of Ohio in 1865, but then successfully ran for Congress in 1866. Sort of. That was the whole contested election with Columbus Delano that I told you about a while ago. After Congress, he mostly retired to private life, and when he finally died in 1893, he was buried at Mount Vernon, Ohio. I have a confession to make. I told you at the beginning of this video that there were 54 Congressional George Washingtons. I told you that it started in 1817, and I told you that all of them became representatives and none became senators. Those were all lies. Sort of. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you George Washington Campbell. Campbell was a representative from Tennessee from 1803 to 1809, and then a senator from Tennessee from 1811 to 1814, and again from 1815 to 1818. Between those Senate terms, he was briefly U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and after his Senate terms, he was briefly ambassador to Russia. So, why did I leave him out? Well, George Washington Campbell was not named after George Washington. For one, Campbell was born in 1769, before the Revolutionary War. At that time, George Washington was just a guy who had fought in the French and Indian War and then married a rich widow and operated a full-time plantation in Virginia. Sure, he was locally a wealthy, prominent citizen, but he wasn't a national celebrity. Furthermore, Campbell was born in Scotland, and if Washington wasn't a national celebrity in 1769, he certainly wasn't an international celebrity. So just how in the hell did he end up with the name George Washington? Well, after digging through all my usual sources and finding no useful information, I did finally find the answer. He did it himself. According to the Tennessee Encyclopedia, George Campbell was born in Scotland in 1769. His family moved to North Carolina in 1772. He graduated from Princeton in 1794 and settled in Tennessee to open up a law practice. While he was a student at Princeton, his fellow students nicknamed him George Washington because his name was George, just like the president. And from that point on, Campbell just adopted Washington as his middle name. So, in a literal sense, George Washington Campbell was a Congressional George Washington, but since he wasn't named after the George Washington, and apparently wasn't even actually named George Washington at all, he does not count for this video. So no, I didn't lie to you. There were 54 Congressional George Washingtons, it did start in 1817, and they were all representatives, none of them became senators. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Blue Sky. I have been the Congressman, and I will see you next time.